Good evening, and welcome back to Footnotes Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and we return to the great work of Flavius Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews. Book 2 closed on the far shore of the Red Sea, with Egypt's chariots beneath the waves and a freed people turning at last toward the mountain of God. Tonight we open Book 3, and we give it complete, in plain modern English, from Whiston's grand old public domain translation. The plain rendering and the asides are my own. This is Book 3, Part 1. The miracle is behind them, now comes the wilderness, and the wilderness is a hard schoolmaster. We will watch a thirsty multitude turn on Moses at the bitter spring, and see the water made sweet. We will see bread fall from the sky, in quails cover the camp, and water break from a struck rock. We will watch the first battle of a free people against the Amalekites, one while an old man's arms are held up upon a hill. And we will meet Moses' father-in-law, Raguel the priest of Midian, some call Jethro, who looks at one exhausted judge trying to settle a whole nation's quarrels and gives him the oldest piece of management advice in the world. Let us begin.
After the Hebrews had been delivered in such a marvelous way, the country through which they had to travel became a severe trial for them. It was nothing but desert, with no food to support them and very little water. There was not enough for the people, and not enough even for the cattle, because the land was dried out and had no moisture to nourish plants. Since there was no other road open to them, they were forced to pass through this barren region. They had brought water with them from the country they had crossed before, just as their leader had told them to do, but when that supply was gone, they had to draw water from wells with great difficulty, because the ground was hard. The water they found was bitter, unfit to drink, and scarce. As they traveled in this condition, they came late in the evening to a place called Marah, a name it had received from the badness of its water, since Mar means bitterness. They arrived there worn down by the length of the journey and by their lack of food, for their provisions had now failed completely. There was a well at Marah, and that was what made them choose to stay there. Though it was not enough to satisfy so large a company, it still gave them some comfort, since even such a thing was welcome in a desert. Those who had gone ahead to search told them that if they went farther they would find nothing. Yet the water there was bitter and unfit for human beings to drink, and it was so bad that even the cattle could hardly bear it. When Moses saw how deeply discouraged the people were, he knew that the cause of their distress could not simply be denied. They were not like a trained army of men able to meet hardship with steady courage. There were many children among them, and women too, whose weakness and distress could not easily be answered by arguments, and their suffering weakened the courage of the men as well. Moses was therefore in great difficulty, and he took the misery of every one of them upon himself. They all ran to him and begged him for help. The women pleaded for their infants, and the men pleaded for the women, asking him not to abandon them, but to find some way, by whatever means he could, to save them. Moses then turned to God in prayer, asking him to change the water from its present foulness and make it fit to drink. When God granted this favor, Moses took the top of a piece of wood lying at his feet, split it down the middle, and cut it lengthwise. He let it down into the well and told the Hebrews that God had listened to his prayers and had promised to make the water what they wanted it to be, provided that they would obey what Moses commanded them and would not do it carelessly or half-heartedly. When they asked what they must do so that the water might be changed for the better, he ordered the strongest men who were standing there to draw water up from the well. He told them that when most of it had been drawn out, what remained would be fit to drink. They worked at it until the water had been stirred and cleansed enough to be drinkable. From there, they moved on and came to Elim. From a distance the place looked promising, because there was a grove of palm trees there. But when they came near, it proved to be a poor place after all. There were only 70 palm trees, and they were stunted, low, and creeping, because they lacked water. The whole country around them was dry, and the 12 fountains there did not give enough moisture to nourish the trees and make them healthy or useful. These fountains were more like a few damp spots than true springs, for they did not break out of the ground or overflow, and so they could not water the trees sufficiently. When the people dug into the sand, they found no water, and if they managed to take a few drops into their hands, the mud made it useless. The trees were too weak to bear fruit, because the water did not sufficiently feed or revive them. So the people blamed their leader and complained bitterly against him. They said that their miserable condition and all the hardships they were suffering were his fault. They had now traveled a full 30 days, had used up all the supplies they had brought with them, and had found no relief, so they sank into deep despair. Because they fixed their minds only on their present troubles, they failed to remember the deliverances they had already received from God, and also through the courage and wisdom of Moses. They became very angry with their leader, and were eager to stone him, treating him as the direct cause of their present misery. Moses, however, though the multitude was enraged and violently opposed to him, confidently trusted in God, and in the knowledge that he had faithfully cared for his own people. He came into the middle of the crowd even while they were shouting against him and holding stones in their hands to kill him. He had a commanding presence and great power to persuade by his words, so he began to soften their anger. He urged them not to dwell so completely on their present hardships that they allowed the blessings already given to them to slip from their memory. He begged them not to let their present discomfort drive out of their minds the great and wonderful favors and gifts they had received from God, but to expect deliverance from troubles which they could not escape by their own power, through that divine providence which watched over them. It was likely, he said, that God was testing their virtue and exercising their patience through these hardships, so that it might be seen what courage they had, how well they remembered the wonderful works he had already done for them, and whether they would fail to think of those works when faced with present suffering. He told them that they did not appear to be truly good men, either in patience or in remembering the successes granted to them. At one time they showed contempt for God and his commands, though it was by those commands that they had left Egypt. At another time they behaved badly toward Moses, the servant of God, even though he had never deceived them either in what he said or in what he ordered them to do by God's command. He reminded them of all that had happened, how the Egyptians had been destroyed when they tried to detain them against God's command, how the same river that became blood for the Egyptians and was unfit to drink remained sweet and drinkable for them, how they had passed by a new road through the sea, which withdrew far away from them, so that they themselves were preserved while they saw their enemies destroyed, and how, when they lacked weapons, God supplied them in abundance. Moses recounted every particular case in which, when they seemed about to be destroyed, God had saved them in an astonishing manner. He said that God still had the same power, and that they must not now despair of his care for them. He urged them to remain quiet and to understand that help would not come too late, even if it did not come immediately, so long as it arrived before any great disaster overtook them. They should reason, he said, that God delayed his assistance not because he had no regard for them, but because he first wished to test their courage and their love of freedom. He wished to know whether they had souls great enough to endure hunger and lack of water for the sake of freedom, or whether they would rather be slaves like cattle, owned by men who feed them generously only to make them more useful in service. As for Moses himself, he said he was not chiefly concerned for his own preservation. If he died unjustly, he would not count it a misfortune, but he was concerned for them, lest by throwing stones at him they should be judged to have condemned God himself. In this way Moses calmed the people, restrained them from stoning him, and brought them to regret what they had been about to do. Since he believed that the necessity pressing on them made their anger less blameworthy, he thought he ought to turn to God in prayer and supplication. He went up to a height and asked God to send the people some help and some way of deliverance from the need they were in, because in God alone lay their hope of salvation. He also asked God to forgive what necessity had driven the people to do, since human nature is hard to please and very prone to complain under adversity. God promised that he would care for them and give them the help they desired. When Moses had heard this from God, he came down to the multitude. As soon as they saw the joy on his face because of the promises he had received, their own sad expressions changed to gladness. Moses stood in the midst of them and told them that he came from God with deliverance from their present distress. A little while later, an immense number of quails appeared. This bird is more abundant in the Arabian Gulf than anywhere else. They flew over the sea and hovered above the Hebrews until, worn out by the labor of their flight and flying, as they usually do, very near the ground, they fell down among the people. The Hebrews caught them, satisfied their hunger with them, and understood that this was the means by which God intended to supply them with food. Moses then gave thanks to God for sending his assistance so suddenly, and even sooner than he had promised. Immediately after this first supply of food, God sent them a second. As Moses was lifting up his hands in prayer, dew fell down, and when Moses found that it stuck to his hands, he understood that this too had come from God as food for the people. He tasted it. Since the people did not know what it was, and thought that snow had fallen, and that it was only the usual fall of that season of the year, Moses told them that this dew had not fallen from heaven in the way they imagined, but had come for their preservation and nourishment. He tasted it and gave some of it to them, so that they could be satisfied that what he said was true. They followed their leader's example and were pleased with the food. In sweetness and pleasant taste it was like honey, but in substance it resembled bdellium, one of the sweet spices, and in size it was equal to coriander seed. They were very eager to gather it, but they were commanded to gather it equally, an omer each day for every person. This was done so that the food would not be distributed too unevenly, and so that the weaker people would not lose their share because the stronger overpowered them in gathering it. Yet when the strong gathered more than the measure appointed for them, they still had no more than the others. They had only tired themselves by gathering extra, for each found that he had only an omer. What was surplus gave them no advantage at all, because it spoiled, bred worms, and became bitter. This food was therefore divine and wonderful. It also supplied the place of other kinds of food for those who ate it. Even now, throughout the whole region, this manna comes down with the rain, just as Moses then obtained from God that it should be sent to the people for their sustenance. The Hebrews call this food manna, because in our language the word man is the form of a question, meaning, "What is this?" The Hebrews rejoiced greatly over what had been sent to them from heaven. They used this food for 40 years, for as long as they remained in the wilderness. After they moved from there, they came to Rephidim, where they were distressed by thirst to the last degree. In the preceding days they had found a few small fountains, but now they found the ground entirely without water, and their condition became desperate. Once again they turned their anger against Moses. At first he avoided the fury of the multitude, and then he turned to God in prayer, begging him that, just as he had given them food when they were in the greatest need of it, he would now give them drink also, for the gift of food was of no value to them while they had nothing to drink. God did not delay long in granting this. He promised Moses that he would provide them with a fountain and plenty of water from a place where they did not expect any. He commanded Moses to strike with his rod the rock that lay before them, and from it to receive an abundance of what they needed, for God had arranged that drink should come to them without labor or painful effort. When Moses had received this command from God, he came to the people who were waiting and watching him, since they had already seen him hurrying down from the height. As soon as he arrived, he told them that God would deliver them from their present distress, and had granted them an unexpected favor. He announced that, for their sake, a river would run out of the rock. They were amazed when they heard this, supposing that in their thirst and weariness from the journey they would have to cut the rock to pieces. But Moses only struck the rock with his rod, a passage opened, and water burst out in great abundance, clear and plentiful. The people were astonished at this marvelous effect, and it was as though the very sight of it began to quench their thirst. They drank the water, and it was pleasant and sweet, as one would expect when God was the giver. They also admired the honor God had shown to Moses, and they returned thanks to God for his providence by offering sacrifices. The scripture kept in the temple tells how God had foretold to Moses that water would be drawn from the rock in this way. The name of the Hebrews had already become famous everywhere, and reports about them were spreading widely. This caused the people who lived in those regions to become very afraid. They sent ambassadors to one another, urging each other to defend themselves and to try to destroy the Hebrews. The chief instigators were the inhabitants of Gabalitis and Petra. They were called Amalekites, and they were the most warlike of the nations living in that area. Their kings urged one another and their neighbors to join in war against the Hebrews. They said that an army of strangers, people who had escaped from slavery under the Egyptians, was lying in wait to ruin them. Common prudence and concern for their own safety, they argued, did not allow them to overlook such an army. They ought to crush the Hebrews before they gathered strength and became prosperous, and before they perhaps attacked first, presuming on the laziness of those who had not struck them earlier. They said they should take vengeance on the Hebrews for what they had done in the wilderness, and that this would not be so easily accomplished after the Hebrews had once seized their cities and possessions. Those who try to crush a power at its first rise, they said, are wiser than those who try to stop it only after it has become formidable. The latter seem merely angry at the prosperity of others, but the former leave their enemies no chance to become troublesome. After sending messages of this kind both to neighboring nations and among themselves, they resolved to attack the Hebrews in battle. These actions by the peoples of those countries brought Moses into perplexity and trouble, for he had not expected such preparations for war. When those nations were ready to fight, and the multitude of the Hebrews was forced to risk the fortune of battle, the Hebrews were in great disorder and lacked all necessities, yet they had to make war against men who were thoroughly prepared for it. Moses then began to encourage them. He urged them to take heart, to rely on the help of God, by which they had been brought into freedom, and to hope for victory over those who were now ready to fight them in order to deprive them of that blessing. He told them to imagine their own army as numerous and lacking nothing, neither weapons, nor money, nor provisions, nor any of the other supplies that make men fight boldly when they possess them. They should judge that they had all these advantages in the assistance of God. They should also consider the enemy's army as small, unarmed, weak, and lacking all the resources that must be lacking whenever it is God's will that an army be defeated. They had already learned in many trials how valuable God's assistance was, and those trials had been more terrible than war. War was only against men, but they had faced famine and thirst, things unconquerable by their own nature, and mountains too, and a sea that offered them no path of escape. Yet all those difficulties had been overcome by God's gracious kindness to them. Therefore Moses exhorted them to be brave at this time, and to regard all their future prosperity as depending on their present conquest of their enemies. With these words Moses encouraged the multitude. He then called together the princes of their tribes and their chief men, speaking to them both separately and all together. He charged the young men to obey their elders, and the elders to listen to their leader. The people were lifted up in spirit and became ready to try their fortune in battle. They hoped that by this fight they would at last be delivered from all their miseries. They even urged Moses to lead them at once against their enemies, without the least delay, so that no hesitation would hinder their present resolve. Moses then sorted all who were fit for war into separate troops and placed Joshua, the son of Nun, of the tribe of Ephraim, over them. Joshua was a man of great courage, patient under hardship, very capable both of understanding what was proper and of saying it, and deeply serious in the worship of God. He was indeed, like another Moses, a teacher of piety toward God. Moses also appointed a small party of armed men to remain near the water and to guard the children, the women, and the whole camp. That whole night they prepared themselves for battle. They took their weapons, if any had arms that were well made, and they attended to their commanders, ready to rush out to fight as soon as Moses gave the order. Moses also stayed awake, instructing Joshua in how he should arrange his camp. When day began, Moses called Joshua again and exhorted him to prove by his actions that he truly was the kind of man his reputation led people to expect. He urged him to gain glory in the present expedition, in the eyes of those under his command, by his deeds in this battle. Moses also gave a particular exhortation to the leading men of the Hebrews, and he encouraged the whole army as it stood armed before him. After he had animated the army by both words and actions, and had prepared everything, he withdrew to a mountain and committed the army to God and to Joshua. The armies then joined battle. It became a close fight, hand to hand, with both sides showing great eagerness and encouraging one another. While Moses stretched his hands toward heaven, the Hebrews were stronger than the Amalekites. But Moses could not keep his hands stretched out continually, and as often as he let his hands down, his own people began to lose ground. So he ordered his brother Aaron and Hur, the husband of their sister Miriam, to stand on either side of him, hold up his hands, and not allow his weariness to interrupt the raising of them, but to help him keep them extended. When this was done, the Hebrews overcame the Amalekites by force. Indeed, all the Amalekites would have perished if the coming of night had not forced the Hebrews to stop killing any more of them. Thus our forefathers gained a most remarkable and timely victory. They not only conquered those who fought against them, but also terrified the neighboring nations. They gained great and splendid advantages from their enemies by the hard labor they endured in this battle. When they captured the enemy's camp, they obtained ready spoil both for the community and for their private families, whereas until then they had not possessed any abundance even of necessary food. This battle, once won, became the cause of their prosperity not only at that moment, but also for later times. They did not merely make slaves of the bodies of their enemies, they subdued their minds as well, and after this battle they became frightening to all who lived around them. They also acquired a vast quantity of riches. A great deal of silver and gold was left in the enemy's camp, along with bronze vessels used commonly in households. There were also many utensils of embroidered work, including woven materials and ornaments belonging to armor, as well as other things useful in a household and for furnishing rooms. They also took the prey of the enemy's cattle and everything commonly carried with camps when they moved from place to place. The Hebrews now valued themselves for their courage, claimed great credit for their valor, and continually trained themselves to endure labor, believing that by labor every difficulty could be overcome. Such were the consequences of this battle. On the next day Moses stripped the dead bodies of their enemies and gathered together the armor of those who had fled. He gave rewards to those who had distinguished themselves in the action, and he highly praised Joshua, their general, whose great deeds were attested by the whole army. Not one of the Hebrews had been killed, while the dead in the enemy's army were too many to count. Moses then offered sacrifices of thanksgiving to God and built an altar, which he named the Lord the Conqueror. He also foretold that the Amalekites would be utterly destroyed, and that in time none of them would remain, because they had fought against the Hebrews while the Hebrews were in the wilderness and in distress. Moses also refreshed the army with feasting. In this way they fought their first battle after leaving Egypt against those who dared to oppose them. After Moses had celebrated this festival for the victory, he allowed the Hebrews to rest for a few days. Then he led them out after the battle in military order, for they now had many soldiers in light armor. Continuing gradually onward, he came to Mount Sinai, 3 months after they had left Egypt. At that mountain, as has already been related, the vision of the bush and the other wonderful appearances had taken place. When Raguel, Moses' father-in-law, learned how prosperous Moses' affairs had become, he gladly came to meet him, together with Moses' wife and children, and Moses was pleased by his arrival. After Raguel had offered sacrifice, he prepared a feast for the multitude near the bush that Moses had formerly seen. The people, each according to their families, shared in the feast. Aaron and his family received Raguel, and they sang hymns to God as the one who had brought about their deliverance and their freedom. They also praised their leader, Moses, because by his virtue everything had succeeded for them. Raguel, in his speech of thanksgiving to Moses, gave great praise to the whole multitude. He could not help admiring Moses for his courage and for the humanity he had shown in delivering his friends. The next day, Raguel saw Moses surrounded by a crowd of business, because Moses was deciding the disputes of those who brought their cases to him. Everyone still came to Moses, believing that they would obtain justice only if he served as the judge. Even those who lost their cases did not resent it, because they believed they had lost justly and not through partiality. Raguel said nothing to him at that time, since he did not wish to hinder those who wanted to make use of their leader's virtue. But afterward he took Moses aside, and when he had him alone, he instructed him about what he ought to do. He advised Moses to leave the trouble of lesser cases to others, while he himself cared for the greater matters and for the safety of the people. There were other Hebrews, Raguel said, who could be found fit to decide ordinary cases, but no one except Moses could care for the safety of so many tens of thousands. Do not be unaware of your own virtue, or of what you have done by serving under God for the people's preservation. Allow common cases, therefore, to be decided by others. Reserve yourself for attendance on God alone, and search out ways to preserve the multitude from their present distress. Use the method I propose to you in human affairs. Review the army, and appoint chosen rulers over tens of thousands, then over thousands. Then divide them into groups of 500s, then hundreds, then 50s, and set rulers over each of them, who may further divide them into 30s and keep them in order. Finally, number them by 20s and by 10s. Let there be one commander over each number, named according to the number of those over whom he rules. Let these commanders be men whom the whole multitude has tested and approved as good and righteous. Let these rulers decide the controversies that arise among the people. But if any great case comes up, let them bring knowledge of it before rulers of higher rank, and if any great difficulty arises that is too hard even for their decision, let them send it to you. By these means 2 benefits will be gained. The Hebrews will receive justice, and you will be able to attend constantly on God and make him more favorable to the people. This was Raguel's advice. Moses received it kindly and acted according to his suggestion. He did not hide who had devised this method, nor did he pretend that it was his own invention. Instead, he told the multitude who had invented it. Indeed, in the books he wrote, Moses named Raguel as the person who devised this ordering of the people, because he thought it right to give truthful testimony to worthy persons, even though he might have gained reputation by claiming another man's invention as his own. From this we may learn the virtuous character of Moses. There will be a proper occasion to speak about that character elsewhere in these books.
And there we will pause, with the camp ordered, the judges appointed, and Raguel gone home to Midian well pleased. The people who walked out of Egypt a frightened mob are becoming something like a commonwealth fed, watered, defended, and governed. But they are not yet a people under law. Before them stands the mountain wrapped in cloud and fire, and Moses is about to climb it alone. Next time, in part 2, the thunder on Sinai, the giving of the law, and the building of the tabernacle, the tent made to carry the presence of God through the desert. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.